Simon Johnson is back with us to talk about a number of things, the economy, the financial markets, and his article in the Atlantic Monthly, The Quiet Coup, a lengthy article about the financial markets collapse. And as we get going here, I'm paging through to one particular portion. But before we start, why don't you tell us what that means, that title, The Quiet Coup?
Oh, the title is actually chosen by the editors of The Atlantic. It wasn't my idea. But I kind of like it, actually. The point of the article is that the financial sector has become too strong in this country. Around about 1980, we probably had a healthy level of financial sector activity, got a little bit bigger, that was fine. But as we got into this boom, really big boom in financial services, the money that they made was sort of plowed back into political connections and political power, which then created new economic opportunities. In the article, we go through all the things that didn't get regulated, for example, because the financial sector didn't want it to be regulated during the 1990s.
And you tie it into the International Monetary Fund's rescue of a number of other countries, Russia, you go back to Indonesia, and here you write that the challenges the United States are familiar territory to people at the IMF. If you hid the name of the country and just showed them the numbers, there is no doubt that old IMF hands would say nationalize troubled banks and break them up as necessary. Explain that for us. Is this the approach that the IMF took in developing countries?
Absolutely. In fact, it's not just the IMF approach, it's the approach that the U.S. Treasury usually pushes very hard for the IMF to implement. So it's a U.S. IMF perspective. And it's not very complicated on economic terms. Obviously, politically, it can be difficult in many situations. And the idea is you've got banks who got themselves into trouble. They're very powerful sponsors of got over-enthusiastic and over-expanded. They have too much debt, they can't sustain it. And you need to take them over, clean them up, usually re-privatize them. I think this word nationalization, which we may get into with some of your callers, is a bit of a misnomer. It's really government-managed bankruptcy, but it does involve the government taking over these banks, managing the cleanup, and then getting them back out into the private sector as soon as they can.
Is there a historical example in the U.S. of the government ever doing that? Did that happen during the Depression?
It did happen during the Depression, although mostly the U.S. experience with that and also in the 1980s with the Resolution Trust Corporation is about taking over failed banks and selling off their assets that are still healthy to other banks immediately, and then managing the stuff you take over that, say, what we now call it toxic debt, bad assets, bad loans. It's had different names in the past. You would take that over, put that in an asset management company and try to minimize your loss on that. The government would manage that part actively.
Why do you think the efforts that the government's made, Secretary Geithner, have not been enough so far?
But it's obviously a very difficult situation. It's not just in the U.S., it's global, it's throughout the financial sector. It's not clear if the efforts are not sufficient. It's still pretty early, but I am on the side of pushing them to do more and do it more quickly, and at least to get the authority to deal with these very big so-called bank holding companies that are not under the traditional purview of the FDIC. The FDIC can't come in and take over these really massive banks in the way it can take over small and medium-sized banks. And I think the government needs to have that power to be able to manage the bankruptcy process of the very biggest companies if necessary.
We are going to open up our phone lines, make sure our viewers know the numbers. 202-737-0001 for Republicans, 202-737-0002 for Democrats, and 202-737-628-0205 for independents. Speaking of the Secretary, he was on Face the Nation yesterday. I wanted to get your reaction to some of the comments to questions he was asked yesterday. Let's take a look. I guess we don't have that clip just yet. We'll show it to you. We'll show that to you in just a minute. Coming out of the G20 meetings, what do you think got done there? What do you think the positive outcomes or didn't get done as the case may be?
I think the worst and positive outcomes. I think the Obama administration should get good credit for them. I think they worked very hard. They didn't get the big items that they wanted or that people like me were arguing for. There was no agreement on more fiscal stimulus around the world. There was no serious discussion of monetary policy, further monetary easing. And the discussion on regulation of banks was pretty lame, in my opinion. And there was no discussion also what you do with the toxic assets, the issues around the U.S. banking system that are really much more general than just the U.S. But having said all that, they did make some progress in putting a lot more money into the International Monetary Fund, which can be used to help countries get into trouble. And in Europe right now, there's a lot of countries in serious trouble. And they also made some significant moves on the governance of the IMF that's going to are really going to pay off down the road.
So how much money extra money is the IMF going to have?
The IMF is going to get extra money, $750 billion, which will take them to a total of $1 trillion which I think is actually not enough, to be honest, if things get bad, but it's a start. And they also created some mechanisms for further increasing the IMF resources that they can draw on as needed going forward.
How much of that is U.S. money?
Well, I don't think we know exactly. I think what we're going to see is about $100 billion from the U.S. And there's also a somewhat complicated so-called special drawing rights allocation, which is money we receive. We don't put it in. We receive it, and then we can choose whether or not to lend it out to other countries. So there was some money creation angle, about $250 billion, in addition to us putting in some new money in the form of a loan.
Sort of political question on that, though. If it's $100 billion or whatever, would the President have to come to Congress to request it for the IMF to get that money?
I think that there would have to be, there's certainly got to be consultation with Congress. I think there has to be some authorization from Congress. Now, exactly how you do it, depends on how they want to handle it through the government bookkeeping. And the Federal Reserve, for example, can make a loan to the IMF on an interim basis. But I think they'll want to come, they have to come to Congress, they want to come to Congress and explain what the strategy is and explain why supporting the IMF is actually good for the global economy right now.
Simon Johnson with us until 9 o'clock Eastern for your calls. Let's hear first from Fort Lauderdale. Good morning, Florida. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning. I wanted to just make a quick comment. We have many people. I mean, I'm creating a list here of people who saw this actually coming and who predicted this exactly the way it's happening. People like Gerald Celente, Ron Paul, Peter Schiff, Lyndon LaRoche. I mean, and the list goes on and on. Bob Chapman. What is the probabilities that, or you, Mr. Johnson, if you can comment, the probabilities that you think that this was actually created and actually what they did through the IMF was enslaving these other countries? I mean, because through debt you can enslave these countries, and these countries from the G20 that met are actually getting a piece of the pie from all these other countries. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but I don't think there was any kind of conspiracy here or any kind of conscious action. I think actually we're in serious trouble precisely because the very large banks mismanaged this great amount of economic power they got. Certainly behind the scenes there's an intertwining of political power and economic power, and that I think does need to be addressed going forward. But this is something we've really stumbled into, the U.S., and globally I think people are even more blindsided than the government in this country.
You use the term in the article in the Atlantic, oligarchy, quite a number, and here part of the article talks about the Wall Street Washington corridor, the connection. What trouble do you see in that?
Well, I think there's nothing wrong with Wall Street having a voice in Washington. Obviously, everybody wants to have and deserves to have a voice in Washington. But I think we've become tilted too far towards sort of Wall Street preponderance. For example, we think the Department of Defense, which is, among other things, a very effective advocate for the military, we think it should be headed by a civilian. We don't think it should be headed by an acting, serving general or admiral. And that I think, sort of speaks to the issue of how powerful should you let an individual group get. And I think Wall Street has taken too much influence, both in the administration and, I would stress, on Capitol Hill.
But you also have that corridor, and your analogy to the Defense Department, you have people leaving the military and going to work for contractors. So you have people leaving Washington going to work for Goldman Sachs and vice versa.
Right, there's a revolving door. So people obviously leave the administration, go work for the big investment banks, they come back and have an influence on policy. There's nothing wrong with that, per se. There's lots of very smart, honorable, good people. And you also need technical experts who really understand how any industry works when you're trying to make policy relative to an industry that's so critical like finance. But I think that if you, and again the article tries to go through this in detail, I think it's gone too far. So its disproportionate influence has actually damaged us and the financial sector itself.
Well, is the point of your article also that the government has gone too far in trying to rescue the financial sector, not just the sector, but the individuals involved, the companies involved, and your call for nationalization of banks or partial takeover of banks is the answer?
Well, I do think that the government has to get involved in saving this sector. The financial sector in any country is far too important. But I think the means which they've adopted have been too favorable to the insiders, the people running these big banks, and the people who quite honestly got us into this amount of trouble. So I'm not saying we should back away from this sector. I think, unfortunately, you've got to deal with it. I think down the road we're going to have to break up these big banks. Anything that's too big to fail is too big to exist, as far as I'm concerned.
Is there a role for the government in setting things like compensation levels and bonus levels?
Well, Ideally, you would address those sorts of things through the taxation system, the redistribution. I think under extraordinary circumstances like those we face today, the government has to get involved in that, particularly when they're supporting companies who are then paying out some of the money that we're putting in as taxpayers. They're paying it out as bonuses that, quite honestly, are not justified and quite mind-boggling.